Hi everyone, we are at Module 3 for Intro to Rehabilitation Counseling this week, and I really want to acknowledge all your hard work and effort in the discussion post so far. I've been very pleased with all of that. I'm happy to see everybody's participating, and I don't mean just participating because you want or need to get the points to participate, but really actively engaging with each other and discussing some of the laws that are out there right now that are important to us as rehabilitation and mental health counselors, right? So today it might seem like we're kind of veering off a little bit in terms of having looked at older legislation that has been modified, amended into newer legislation, and kind of taking a break before we get into a 2-week long module on the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it's important that at this point, because now you've got a foundational understanding of the laws that have been enacted in our country and where they've kind of developed to over the past, for some of them, we're getting close to a century here, really, for some of those really old original laws that came about after the earlier world wars, right? So now it's important for us to kind of think a little bit more in depth about our values as a society and our beliefs and the role of disability status in this country specifically, and I mean historically, so I'm just not talking about 2020 and the new 2020 that we're currently in, but more or less kind of the history of how society has perceived individuals that would have either disability or mental health impairment, and most often in a negative way. And that's to the detriment of a very large minority group, well, really, truly, it's the largest minority group in the country, in the world. So it's important for us to take a step back for a moment before we get into the ADA, which is a massive piece of legislation that you got to be familiar with. But part of this discussion, part of our discussion this week, and part of what I want you to be doing is not only being open-minded and understanding of where we've come as a society, where we came from, how far we progressed, but also being mindful of how much further we still have to go, and how our perceptions of disability, how we have failed to value individuals with disabilities and mental health impairments in our society on all different levels, continues to impact their representation and on all aspects of our lives, even in this postmodern era that we're living in, right? So there still is definitely room to grow with it. And I always find myself teetering a little bit, especially in the discussion post, because I do like for people to take a positive spin on our roles, and that's kind of where where we start out in thinking about foundational values of rehabilitation and mental health counselors in general. That we are, of course, attentive to all the influences in the environment that impact or have an impact on our clientele. So whether it's societal attitudes, which are constantly in flux, political philosophies, constantly in flux, and technology, which is continuously improving and being modified in ways that are making technology more accessible to the mainstream population, but as a result of that, accessible to individuals with disabilities in different ways. So we're attentive to influences in the environment. We also understand how somebody's immediate environment, whether that be the family, the community that they have grown up in or currently reside in, the region of the country that they might live in or have come from, the region of the world they might have come from, and their residence. So even within a household, things can really differ in terms of how a family member perceives disability or mental health, and how that family member or caregiver's perception of disability has a direct impact on how that person sees themselves as well, which has longer lasting effects in a variety of different areas. So in terms of our foundational values as rehabilitation counselors, and I'm not trying to impose values on you all, but these are values, core values to the profession. And so when we start to think about ourselves and start to identify as counselors, so we are identifying this one profession that we all collectively belong to. And it's important for us to to recognize that even as that subspecialty area of rehabilitation, clinical mental health counselors, right? But collectively, as a counseling profession, these are all foundational values for our profession. And so you will find that hopefully throughout the semester, we continuously talk about professional identity, and hopefully you all start to develop your own professional identity as counselors, because you're counseling students, and that's where you're going to, right? It'll be here before you know it. We're taking a strength-based orientation, and this has historically been difficult for rehabilitation counselors, specifically because a lot of the work that rehabilitation counselors have historically done is based upon a medical disability, medical impairment, right? So we're combing through medical files. We're looking at test results. We have been told what a person's inabilities are, what their deficits are, what their limitations are. And so kind of the newer outlook on all of it, and even in mental health counseling, if we think about the foundations of counseling and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and looking at, how people could theoretically be fixed, if you will. That all comes from the medical model, and really was taking a weaknesses or limitation-based orientation. Now, and we've been doing this for quite some time, now we're looking at people in terms of what they are able to do, what their abilities are, what their strengths are, what their goals are, and we're helping facilitate their progress toward a goal. So we're very optimistic people about the nature of our profession. But we really, if you ever find yourself being pessimistic in the work that you're doing, take that as a red flag that you need a break, that you need to step away, and there's potential for you to be doing harm to others, because that pessimistic outlook, when we start to think negatively about our clients, when we start to categorize them as a whole, and that nothing is ever working and nobody's ever going anywhere and the work that we do is meaningless, all of those things impact our ability to provide effective and ethical counseling services to clients who are already in marginalized, vulnerable, oppressed, typically, situations. And so we have to have that optimistic approach, right? In terms of the values that we hold, we are also understanding of how important it is to maintain professional and collaborative relationships, because we can't be doing it all on our own. So you have a course where you're reflecting on the case management process, and rehab client services, where you're becoming aware of the many different types of services that are out there for your clients or future clients. And so it's important that we're connecting in our communities, that we are exchanging business cards, that we are able to know who to refer a client to if they need it and when they need it. We know where other rehab counselors and mental health counselors are employed. We know where to direct people when we know that the services that we're providing can't meet the needs of our clients. We're also often working on interdisciplinary teams. I talk to doctors and nurses in my work as a rehabilitation counselor. I talk to insurance providers, claims managers, people that are affiliated with Social Security disability, because these were all people that were interacting in my client's life. And so part of what my work would be to provide advocacy or assist them in developing their self-advocacy skills. So we do maintain those collaborative partnerships. I'm not going to completely go through all of the, the holistic service provision. About midway through the semester, you're going to have a couple of weeks where we're really getting into what counselors do, what their roles are, and what assessment might look like. So as far as slide 3 goes, we're just going to kind of skim on by it because I don't want to keep it too long. So when we are thinking about disability in terms of the economical aspects of disability, sociological aspects of disability, it's not something that we're always so open to discuss, right? Because it can become uncomfortable to talk about these things, because historically, again, people with disabilities and mental health impairments have been mistreated, to put it lightly. But we have to be talking about these things. We have to kind of be bringing up these difficult conversations, and a lot of it does tie into what has proven to be a a hot topic discussion post that you'll find at the end of the module where you're examining your own implicit bias. So when we're thinking about economical aspects of disability, we have to look at and review consistently and continuously the disability statistics that are out there. So we have to be aware of the barriers that our clients are facing in terms of their access to services, their right to services, who deems what quote unquote a right is in this country. We have to be considerate of what economic influences are put on our clients versus morality and who defines morals. And certain economic conditions of the country really play an active role in the services that are available to our clients, and in a lot of instances the jobs that are available to us, and so it's all very important and we can't just kind of skim over it, which again ties back to last week when we were really talking about and engaging in discussion about the different types of laws that are out there that apply to the clients that we're serving. And also this will kind of obviously tie into the legislative assignments that are going to be due soon. So in terms of labor force characteristics, I unfortunately don't have the latest up-to-date statistics because they're not released. They usually get released about typically in February, as you can see. So we're not quite there, but look out for them. So in terms, so this all comes from the Census Bureau, right? And so when we're looking at people that report disability, about 12.8% of the population in the United States report having a disability. Of that, 18.7% of people that are identified as having a disability are employed, compared to 65% of people without a disability. And so there's a wide gap here. There always has been. We as counselors and professionals and advocates always want to see a narrowing of that gap. We have seen in more recent years a little bit of progress in this area, meaning like 1% of progress. A couple years ago, I think it was 17 point something percent of people with disabilities were employed compared to like 60%. So it's not, because right now we're, in terms of economics, we're in a pretty good position. Unemployment rates are down in general. When we see unemployment rates go up, like we did after the recession, obviously we saw unemployment rates of people with disabilities spike as well. So they kind of go hand in hand, but we can't ignore how much of a gap that actually is. There are lots of different reasons why people with disabilities are underemployed, or why there's such a wide discrepancy in terms of the numbers of people out there with disabilities that are employed versus unemployed. Part of it is because some people with disabilities simply can't work. That's not something that we determine necessarily. We might be involved in the process of making that type of determination, but some people just are simply not able to work at that moment in their lives. A lot of it does have to do with society, still our evolving understanding of people with disabilities, the capabilities of people with disabilities, the value that they bring to the workforce, and the contributions that they can make to society. A lot of people with disabilities are employed part-time compared to people without disabilities. Part-time employment can be very beneficial for people with disabilities. For one, they might have doctor's appointments. They might have limitations where they can't work a full work day. A lot of people are receiving SSDI, so disability benefit programs limit how much income can be made in order to continue to qualify for those disability benefits. So as we kind of touched on last week again, and a couple of you did talk about Social Security disability, I would really encourage all of you to really dig deep into it, not just for test purposes, but just because so many clients are receiving some type of disability benefit. Whether it's SSDI, long-term disability, short-term disability in some cases, workers' compensation, you name it. But for those disability benefit programs, typically they have like a cap on how much a person can work, how much income they can make before the benefit goes away, essentially. So it's very difficult for people to start receiving disability benefits. So obviously they are apprehensive about losing the benefit. It becomes a pretty bad cycle, honestly, that people get into because the benefit programs aren't paying a ton. And typically somebody could earn more, make more on a monthly basis by going to a full-time status, but the risk of losing the benefit outweighs the benefit of getting the extra money. One thing that I learned in my practicum work, which I did in Mon County and surrounding counties, I worked with youth that were receiving SSI, SSDI benefits for those that had eligibility to receive that. And one thing that I found that was eye-opening was that I would get into a home, we would go and visit clients at their home and counsel them on disability benefits, the programs available to them, the benefits of going back to work, lining out the cost of, or how much they were earning on a potential job versus how much they were getting in their disability check. And we would lay all of this out, and it would be beautiful, and I would think, this person's totally going to get that they could go back to work and try it out and not be penalized for it. And then they would say, my family relies on the consistency of this check, and so I'm not going to even attempt it. Or a parent would say that I'm not going to encourage my child to increase the amount of time that they're working because the family relies on the check, and I'm not going to do that. So, there are all different types of reasons why people with disabilities don't work full time. But it's important for us kind of to go back to our values, our beliefs, kind of our how we approach these types of situations is to not just assume that somebody that has a disability or mental health impairment can't work, shouldn't be working, doesn't have the potential to do some type of work, or just mentally put them in the category of somebody that's, manipulating the system. I've, in my experience, found that people with the most severe limitations, the greatest list of limitations, are the ones that want to work the most. It's like the random person that strained their back lifting their 3-year-old child at the age of 25 and said they can't work for the rest of their lives. That's the one that I always had to put myself in check for. And that really did happen to me, one of my clients. So I know I'm off on a tangent here, but okay. So when we're thinking, moving along, in terms of rights, disability rights, what does that mean? What do people have a right to in this country? The golden question, right? Equal opportunity, ideally, right? That's what the foundations of the Rehabilitation Act were built on: the equal opportunity for people with disabilities in all facets of federal government and federal programs. The Americans with Disabilities Act, same thing: equal rights. Equal opportunity to jobs, to employment, to maintaining employment, equal opportunity to walk into a facility, to take a bus ride somewhere, equal a right to education. We see that through IDEA, and right to health care. That one's just continuously being disputed. But we saw that through the ACA, right? So what our society perceives to be somebody's right to a certain opportunity, whether it be employment, education, healthcare, a laundry list of things, changes over time, as we've seen. Tends to be more progressive now than it was before. Ideally, that trend continues. There have been the establishment of all these laws and regulations that have attempted to balance out, what society might perceive to be somebody's right versus, the morals and values of every American in this country. And those opinions differ so greatly because we're a very large country. But it's all still a very hot topic, right? Who bears the burden of the cost? That's the biggest question. And it's a question that everybody has, and it's a valid question, because whenever we are providing services to help individuals with disabilities receive an equal opportunity to certain things, somebody's got to pay for it. And it's the taxpayer dollars more often than not that are paying for it. And so there has to be checks and balances. There have to be reporting processes in place so that taxpayers understand what they're actually paying for and why they're paying for it. That kind of leads into the economic versus moral debate, right? And so from an economic standpoint, and we see this through data like the RSA 911 data, the Rehabilitation Service Administration. And so they are the agency that tracks state vocational rehabilitation agencies and tracks the expenses, how many people are actually going to work, closures of cases. And so consistently we see that the cost of providing these types of services, it pays for itself. Once somebody goes back to work or they enter into the workforce, they're paying taxes, right? Because everybody's got to pay their taxes. There's an increased chance of individuals returning to independent living, developing or maintaining independence for the long term. There's a lower cost of insurance burden on the general population because people could get off of those long-term disability policies, Social Security, disability insurance as well. Those things don't have to last forever. There are kind of these indirect benefits through reasonable accommodation and return to work. And what is meant by that is that if I am working and I see my coworker, Dr. Mambaleo, he works right next door to me. So if I see that he's going through a tough spot, maybe is diagnosed with some kind of medical condition, and I see that my employer is allowing him the time he needs to seek treatment, the time he needs to recuperate from, I don't know, surgery or something like that. If I see that they are understanding and empathetic to the situation, and they are hoping that he comes back to work and are ready to help him transition in a way that is best for him, I see that and I think, wow, this is great, because when it happens to me, because it's not a matter of if, but when this happens to me, my employer is going to treat me the same way. And so that's an indirect benefit in that I, the observing coworker here, am more likely to say, hey, somebody else come work for my great employer. If I'm offered another job, I'm going to be kind of really weighing out whether it's beneficial. So there are these indirect benefits. When it comes to technology, like I said before, it's continuously advancing. We're seeing that a lot of these technological applications that have been around for a really long time, like screen reading, speech to text, are now being mainstreamed, right? Because we've all got our nice little smartphones, and I can talk to my phone and tell it to do whatever I want, and I'm surprised it's not talking back to me, and they're always listening. But so there's this technology and that we have at our fingertips now, all of the embedded accessibility features within everybody's computer. All of that has been around for a really long time, but now that it's improved and it's been marketed to the mainstream population as something that makes everybody's life a little bit easier, convenience technology. Now we're seeing that employers are more willing to accept the use of different types of assistive technologies in the workplace, allowing those individuals with more severe disabilities that need AT, assistive technology, to actually continue to work. But morals, when we're thinking about morals, morals are not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. What my morals are not your morals, and that's for all of you, right? And so we have to be prepared as counselors to address those difficult questions from society, from our family, from our coworkers, from employers, potential employers, for our clients, really to go toe-to-toe with people to help others understand how beneficial it is to be assisting people that have some type of need, whether it be because of a physical disability or a mental health impairment. Okay, so I think I kind of went over the economic conditions that the economic conditions in this country typically have a direct effect on the response of society towards individuals with disabilities. When we got a lot more money, when there's a surplus, when there's a lot of demand for labor, then there's extra cash for these services, right? For these services that are provided to individuals with different disabilities and mental health impairments. So that's understandable. The issue is that when there's not money, that the services that are out there are often the ones that get cut first, or they're on the chopping block first, or funding gets taken away, or you see 3 different agencies that were functioning fine and dandy whenever economic conditions were at an all-time high. All of a sudden, we hit a recession. 3 are combined, 75% of people are laid off, and then what happens? That obviously is going to impact the types of services and the quality of services that are being provided to the people that typically need them the most. So in terms of sociological aspects of disability, so in our society, again, I'm talking about historically, there are kind of these perceptions of disability that we've had, perceptions about the cause, who caused the disability, did the person cause it? somebody else, and how we perceive the cause of disability tends to have an impact on how we perceive the type of services that somebody should be afforded, or the rights that they should be afforded. Whose responsibility was it? What type of threat does an individual, what type of perceived threat do we think is there with that, working with an individual, sharing space with somebody, allowing them access to certain programs, facilities, you name it. And then, of course, when we're thinking about sociological aspects of disability, we absolutely cannot deny different values and trends, but more importantly, the medical model and other models of disability. And so I've provided a lot of resources for you this week on the different models of disability. Those are very important to know about. And more again from a historical standpoint, as we everybody should kind of be operating from the social model of disability now rather than the medical model. And that all ties back to the language, use of language that people were kind of bringing into our discussion threads last week, where a lot of the language that we use and have historically used to refer to people with disabilities, mental health impairments, people in recovery, is all stemmed from the medical model, where things can be fixed, and that is fixed, like quote unquote fixed. So when we're thinking about perceived cause of disability, perceived cause of a disability does not actually equal the cause of the disability, okay? So how we have viewed why somebody has a disability, why they've acquired a disability, been born with a disability, whatever it might be, it's changed over time. I mean, way back when, and even still today, depending on somebody's cultural beliefs, there's been the kind of belief that there are supernatural forces that are essentially or potential punishment from God, and that's why somebody has developed a disability, or a child has been born with a disability. Or, I mean, demonic possession, right? So we've seen, like, even kind of if we're looking at women with mental health impairments, a long-standing history of women with mental health impairments being mistreated and being perceived to be under demonic possession, right? Even when society and the medical community started to understand the root causes of different disabilities, different medical conditions. Even now, as our understanding of mental health impairments is continuously evolving, there's still that apprehension from society to accept it, interestingly enough, right? And so a lot of these belief systems still exist today. And we have to be mindful and aware of that, because our clients may come to us with some of these belief systems in place. So it was not uncommon for me to be talking with a client who needed to have an accommodation made in their workplace because they were having performance problems and just were about to be fired or terminated by their employer. And I would say, okay, well, the first step is requesting an accommodation and providing some acknowledgement and some documentation to your employer that you have a disability. And it was not uncommon for me for the response from my clients to be, I don't have a disability. So part of what our work is helping people understand what we mean when we say disability, what we mean when we say mental health impairment, and that society's view of that, negative view of disability status, we hope that changes and shifts. We see that, I think, more now today than ever before, where there's kind of that normalization of seeking counseling services, which is amazing. So when we think about perceived responsibility as another sociological aspect of disability, depending on somebody's attitudes, beliefs, whatever it might be, that the perceived responsibility is basically that we're thinking the individual is responsible for their own condition and their own situation, that that person is in the state that they're in because they should have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, whatever that means, and gotten themselves back on the job, or gotten themselves the help that they needed or the medical care that they needed. So this perceived responsibility issue is whereas society is saying, this person is not my problem, it's not our problem, why am I having to pay for services that are being provided to this group of individuals whenever they should have been helping themselves, whenever it was their fault that they're in the space that they're in right now. We see that, I mean, to a very great extent. I don't want to say to the greatest extent, but we see this to a very great extent with individuals in recovery that somebody could have easily stopped using, that they didn't have to shoot up that one day, and that started the process of addiction. So we see that now, right? We see that in 2020, and hopefully that perception changes over time. Again, people still have different prejudices, attitudes, beliefs, and biases. And again, I'm going to bring that back to our discussion post about implicit biases. Sometimes those biases are there. We have a bias, but we're not completely aware of it. All right, so perceived threat. So there's this perception that people with disabilities pose a threat to us, that they pose a threat to everybody's safety, that they shouldn't be allowed in the workplace because they're a veteran and they have PTSD, and they're just automatically going to come in with their automatic weapon and kill everybody. That's the perception, right? I mean that very sarcastically here, but it is something that people actually do believe, right? That people with disabilities are a threat to themselves, they're a threat to other people. I would have to combat this with employers all of the time, where if they were aware that somebody had a visual impairment, that they didn't want them walking in high traffic areas. They didn't want them walking up and down stairs. People that had a hearing impairment and wanted to work in a warehouse environment. Oh my goodness, that was such a headache for me, because there was really no safety issue there as long as you're putting accommodations into place. So there's also the perceived threat to the economy, right? That if we start providing services, we start caring for people with disabilities, that we're all going to go broke, and my benefits are going to be impacted because we're helping somebody else. Threat to themselves. The horrific treatment of individuals with disabilities that we've seen throughout history. And by horrific treatment, I mean just like the all-out mass murders of individuals with disabilities during different points in the history of the world. Forced sterilization of people with intellectual disabilities, that was one. The eugenics movement, basically saying that we can just eradicate an entire culture. So, if you're thinking of people with disabilities as a cultural entity, cultural genocide, essentially. And so that's what I mean by horrific treatment. Throwing babies over a mountain because they look different when they were born. Those were justified as a way to help. We're helping our society. We are ridding our society, our communities, of somebody that doesn't look like us, doesn't act like us. And so that in and of itself is going to make everything just fine. Or now, in kind of the postmodern world here, we see helping to the extent of stripping away somebody's independence and somebody's rights. I would see this a lot with employers who would hear from their employee who just got a diagnosis of cancer, for example, and the employer would say, oh, wow, you need to take care of yourself. Go home, come back when you're 100% again, okay? So that's an example of helping to the extent of stripping away independence, because that's putting your belief on somebody else, that you need to take the time. My employee that just has a recent cancer diagnosis, take the time, be with your family. Don't come to work anymore, but don't worry about being paid. We're not going to pay you because we don't have to, because that's the way the laws are written. Use all your vacation time, and then after that, we'll probably fill your position and you won't have a job to come back to anyway. But good luck with your treatments, and we hope to see you soon. So that is an example of where we might perceive, or society might perceive, somebody as being a threat to themselves, and the actions are taking as a way to quote unquote help somebody. All right, when we're thinking about societal values, our values, I mean, take a look at whatever app it's your preference. Facebook, Instagram, open up Google, doesn't matter. Our culture, Western society values functional ability. We value when people are able to be active, mobile, beautiful, have independence from everybody, including like their own family, their own spouses, their children, independence for everybody. The terminology that we use reflects how we have devalued. I should put in there devalued people with disabilities, because even if you think about the term disability, it starts out with dis, and that's devaluing. I personally like the term people with unique abilities, because people with disabilities have unique abilities. It's not just the disability piece of it. But historically, again, we have used terms like people are insane, they're psycho, crazy, inappropriate labeling, depending on what type of that's kind of like the deaf, the dumb, those types of terminology that we've used. Now, there's other terminology like mental retardation that we don't use anymore, largely because of how people took that term mental retardation and turned it into the R word, and put a negative connotation to it. And now here we are in a different space where we're using intellectual disability and crossing our fingers and hoping that people don't spin that negatively as well. There have been trends, of course. We talked about the civil rights movement a bit, and we will continue to do that. The golden era of rehabilitation is kind of whenever all of those really old laws began to be formed, right? Or began to be formed, that's not the right way to say it, but it's late. Whenever we saw those older laws, the founding laws of rehabilitation and mental health counseling come about, as a result, really, of people surviving wars, which is interesting, right? So the medical world became so advanced after like World War I that veterans were actually coming back alive, missing limbs, but alive, having traumatic brain injury, which wasn't TBI at the time, but nevertheless alive and needing to do something. And so that was kind of that golden era of rehabilitation, where there was an acknowledgement that there were a lot of people with disabilities, and society needed to figure out a different way to address the needs of that population. All right, so I put a lot on the module about the different models of disability, and the last handful of slides here talk about each one of those, specifically the medical model, psychosocial, other models of disability. These are all important. I encourage you to really take notes on these, listen to or read the other reference documents that I have, because this is part of an exam, a benefit of listening to me drone on and on in these lectures. So now I do want to take a minute and talk about the discussion. So for this week's discussion, what you're going to be doing is completing the disability IAT, and it is through Project Implicit, which came about as a project under Harvard, like Harvard, the university. A number of other universities have collaborated with Harvard in this long-running survey, and as a result, I can't even imagine how much data they've collected. But they created this project to really examine implicit bias, and this is, I think, the 6th time I've done this in a course, and I warn students every time that you have to be aware of the implicit part of what this survey is looking at, right? Or what the what they're evaluating here, right? Implicit bias. So something that we really have a difficult time measuring is implicit bias. We have a difficult time measuring bias because people don't want to report that they're biased, right? I'm not going to take a survey and say I hate everybody. So even if I know that it's completely anonymous, I'm not going to do that. So that's part of it. So just understand that they had to figure out a way to examine this implicit bias in the best way that they could. No survey instrument is 100% perfect. They acknowledge that as well. So I acknowledge that it's not perfect. There are imperfections here. And I want you to reflect on that in the discussion post too. Tell me what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it. There are a lot of different IATs that you can take. Disability is one. You can do one. Gender, sexual identity, I think, is one of them. Race, a whole host. Okay, so you can take as many as you want. If you've taken it before, fantastic. I think one of the WVU gender studies classes has their students take this. And so you could take it again. That's fine too. Let me know what happened. The results, I ask, were the results surprising? Everybody is surprised by these results. But what I don't want you to do is get mad about them. So if you come into this saying, oh my God, I love everybody and I really love people with disabilities, but man, it tells me that I've got a preference for people that don't have disabilities, then I'm going to get really mad at the test. Don't get mad at the test. Don't get mad at yourself. Just be reflective about this. And that's really all I ask of you. Just be reflective, be mindful of the purpose of it, that I want you to have a discussion about potentially, not necessarily the results of the test itself, but where your implicit biases may have stemmed from in the first place, right? Reflect on how you grew up, what your culture is, what your cultural beliefs are, what your values are, what the values of your parents were, how disability was presented to you growing up. Now there's been differences. I would, and I'm saying this because I was mad at myself whenever I got the results of a disability IAT when I first took it. And I can't remember how I was introduced to this, but I grew up with a mom that was a elementary special education teacher, grew up in her classroom. I, to this day, coach for Special Olympics. And so I did not get the result that I wanted to get. And what did I do? Turned around and took it again and got the result that I wanted to get, because that's kind of what happens with tests, right? So this is kind of my cautionary warning with all of it, because in my experience now with 5 times under my belt doing this discussion, I love it because it gets people thinking, because it disrupts the status quo of discussion boards typically, and because we're in week 3, and so you don't have to play nice anymore. You can really get real with your discussions, and that's what I hope with the discussions, because we're in master's level courses and we should talk about the things that are hard conversations in a safe space before you get out there in the real world. So thank you for listening to me for 40 minutes. I'm going to let you go now. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you all in the discussion posts over the course of the week.